Welcome again to our roundtable. This is Module 7. We're going to talk about receiverships. Now in the module you have noted that the receivership comes about because of the contractual relationship between the secured creditor and the debtor. So this to some extent doesn't include the courts as much and therefore it's a two-party argument. So we're going to start off firstly I should introduce you to the panel. The panel is made up of Trish Tolte, who is a registered liquidator and bankruptcy trustee, Jeanette Muller, who is a registered liquidator, and Glenn Shannon, who was also a registered liquidator, all obviously members of that venerable association AIIP. So now we're going to start off with Trish, and I'm going to basically say, Trish, what is the purpose, as far as the secured creditor is concerned, of appointing a receiver?
The primary purpose of appointing receivers or receivers and managers is to collect the assets and be able to recover debt on behalf of the secured creditor as opposed to the general pool of unsecured creditors, and that arrangement is entered through a contractual arrangement between the secured creditor and the receivers or receivers and managers. Yeah,
so unlike, for example, a liquidator situation, the receiver or the receiver manager owes a duty only to the secured creditor, doesn't owe a duty necessarily to the other creditors.
Yes, that's generally correct. However, there is an overarching obligation still to the unsecured creditors such that you have to keep those obligations in mind as well, but predominantly it is to the secured creditor.
So obviously that's the last task or last action that a secured creditor would take. What's happened before that to get us to that position, do you think, usually?
9 times out of 10 there'll be some sort of event of default which will be included in whatever the contract or loan or financing arrangement between the secured creditor and the entity that you're going to be appointed to, and they'll mostly be monetary defaults, and in some instances they won't always be, but that's generally the lead up. Often the secured creditor has issued demands and other sort, or taken legal action potentially, and generally a receivership appointment will be a fairly last resort because of the costs and the risks and liability to the secured creditor.
So there's normally got to be a substantial breakdown in communication between the secured creditor and the people who've given the security, particularly in the current climate. Banks are reticent to make receivership appointments, and I won't say they don't happen, they do happen, but normally there's a reason for it, whereby just they've got to a position where the secured creditor just can't work with the debtor anymore, and they just think they're going backwards in trying to get an outcome.
So you as a insolvency professional, what's your decision-making process when one of the large four banks approaches you and says, would you accept the appointment as a receiver of XYZ Proprietary Limited? What's your decision-making process when it comes to that?
Well, you want to see that the security is valid and stuff like that, so you know you're validly appointed, and you then go through a thing to see if you've got a conflict in terms of, has anyone in the firm, sort of what relationship do we have with the company that's about to go in receivership. And from that, so long as there's no conflict and you're happy that the security is valid, you'll accept the appointment.
And you'll be seeking some type of indemnity from the secured creditor?
That would be the normal situation, that there's always an indemnity from the secured creditor, and particularly if you're dealing with a large bank. So
yeah. And the time frame of this happening, it seems to me from experience, the appointment, basically the secured creditor's got to a point of exasperation, hasn't got the information it wants, isn't getting responses, and therefore appoints. So what's the what's the time frame usually between a secured creditor making a decision to appoint a receiver and that receiver knocking on the door, do you think, on average?
Normally pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It can vary depending on the tolerances of the particular secured creditor. Bearing in mind, of course, that secured creditors don't always have to be the big four. They can be a number of different financiers, and these days we have a little bit of an explosion in that area. So yes, it just depends. And I suppose in their mind they're thinking, the secured creditor will be thinking, well, how expensive is this going to be, and is this the last resort? Am I going to be able to recover my debt plus the receiver's costs out of this appointment, or is there another way forward?
Well, other than situations where the secured creditor would hold what I know as an all-PAP or a secured interest over all the assets, if the secured creditor only held a single asset, does that change the attitude of a receiver? So it might be a large asset, but it might be just one of many assets.
I don't think that changes the thing of the view of the receiver. I mean, you look at what the asset is and go from there. It's quite often, though, that even if someone's got an all-PAP, they may not appoint over everything, depending on the circumstances.
Sure.
They may still just do an appointment over specific assets. So if, for example, a company's got, say, property, plant equipment, and, say, debtors and other assets, for whatever reason, the bank may decide to just make an appointment over the property and all the plant equipment and the like, and not the other items. It just depends on the circumstances. if, for example, you've got a trading company and the bank thinks there's a trading risk, they might want to explore making an appointment that doesn't cover the trading operations, but covers, say, other assets that are held.
Sure.
And that's generally the most common time when you'll just be appointed to specific assets, as Glenn said, to avoid that trading risk, particularly if they know that there might be sufficient assets to recover the debt just from those specific assets. It's a lot less risk for everybody and less cost, of course, too.
So what's the decision-making process in the secured creditor's brain, a receiver compared to a receiver manager?
Receiver manager, you're normally trading the business as
Yeah.
a receiver of specific property. So, there'll be a review of, inherently are there some issues of trading that may expose the bank and or the receiver, such as environmental issues or whatever in particular. But you just got normal trading risk anyway, so people will look at the particular industry and have a look at the profile of that. But at the end of the day, the bank will make a decision, perhaps with advice as well, as to what's the most appropriate thing to do and the lowest risk thing to do in terms of getting its money back.
And employee entitlements come into it now too, in that particularly with regard to trading and potentially circulating assets. If there's going to be those employee entitlement priority, then that can be quite expensive, and the receiver will have to be involved in that as well. Therefore, if they're just looking at specific assets that are non-circulating, that may be more attractive and a better and more cost-effective outcome.
Sure. So if we have a receiver appointed to a company, the next step as far as the directors are concerned would be the possibility of appointing an administrator. And I would assume that's not a very uncommon thing to happen. So therefore, if that happens, what's the usual relationship between the receiver and the administrator?
Can work sort of harmoniously as such. Both have got sort of different roles to do in essence. So if the receivership covers the whole running of the organisation and whatever, then the receiver will run the organisation. But I mean, the administrator's there really acting for all creditors, not just secured creditor. So it may well be, for example, that there may end up being a deed of company arrangement being proposed where the secured creditor stands outside, but there's still other funds that are there to pay the general body of creditors.
In some cases, you might find that the receiver actually would like an administrator in place and might actually even fund the administrator because of leasing liabilities and other protections that could arise. But ultimately, the administrator's role is limited because most of the heavy lifting will be conducted by the receiver.
So in your experience, as we said before, the appointment of receiver is based on a contractual relationship between the secured creditor and the debtor. How adequate are the agreements between those people? And you said before that we want to check the availability or the ability of you to be appointed a receiver, so validly. Obviously, that's very important because the Act takes care of that, and you could become liable. So, in your experience, is that a fairly straightforward exercise these days, or is there issues?
There's issues. You would be. I know myself, I'm looking at one at the moment where I'm seeking to set aside the appointment of a receiver for my suspicion that the document upon which they're appointed is invalid. So that's a lengthy legal process that we have to go through, and it's a case where I'm alleging that it's avoidable. So until such time as I prove that it gets in front of a court and the court declares that it's void, well, we have to respect the receiver's authority, so to speak, and things continue.
But I think another point to make, just on what you're talking about, is because you've now got perhaps an explosion in some sense of secured creditors, not all of them have necessarily got the best legal advice. And so particularly for what I call smaller secured creditors, some of their agreements are defective.
Sure.
Like I'm looking at a particular matter now where the secured creditor wanted to appoint receivers but couldn't because the document didn't give them the power to appoint receivers. So, and that was just someone mucked up when they had the document drawn up. So, you do need to look at those things, and if people are using solicitors who perhaps aren't sort of normally in banking and finance and the like, and there's a greater propensity, a chance that the documents aren't properly drawn up.
So, coming to the end of the life of a receiver, so the receiver's been appointed, it has basically control the asset over which it's got its interest, and let's assume that the business can still operate without that asset being used. The receiver sells the asset, goes away. How often is that the case, or is it the case that the appointment of the receiver is usually the first domino to fall, as it were? You know, yeah.
It makes it pretty difficult for the debtor to survive the appointment of a receiver, and particularly when you take out a lot of its operating equipment and assets. You'll find that the director has little choice, but if they don't do it voluntarily, they'll probably have to put someone else, another creditor will take action and put them into liquidation.
That's the most common, isn't it, that we see, rather than an administration. Often the two will run in tandem.
Straight to liquidation.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, obviously the credit risk goes up and everyone's worried for an unsecured credit about being paid. So people are going to tighten up credit terms, and that itself alone is likely to put pressure on the cash flow and everything.
Because that's interesting to note, isn't it? So once the receiver comes in, they'll continue to pay for any liabilities that they incur, but that puts a freeze on all of the liabilities that were owing as at the date prior to them being appointed. So those creditors are sort of going, well, when is it going to be my turn to get paid? And, they probably won't, is the
answer to that. All right, well, thank you guys. Again, a good discussion on receivership, so we'll see you again in the next module.